Welcome to Introduction to Visible Learning for Social Studies Professional Development Day, October 16th, 2020. We're going to begin by looking at our learning intentions and success criteria for the day. First, we are learning about the three phases of learning. We want you to be able to describe and give examples of learning at each of the three phases: surface level learning, deep learning, and transfer. Second, to begin aligning instructional strategies with each of the phases of learning. And third, to promote transfer of conceptual understandings to new contexts. So the question might arise, why visible learning, and especially why now? And I included here on this screen a tweet quote from Trevor Muir. I don't know this individual, but he tweeted out, "I'm curious, what kind of PD do you think you could use most right now? Something directly pertaining to teaching during a pandemic, or something that will carry over to a post-pandemic classroom." And the reason I include this is because I think there's a lot of useful discussion here that needs to take place today as we are in the midst of a transition to a different kind of learning here this year, and thinking about what is it that we can take away from this presentation today in our discussions. What can we take away that's immediately useful, and what are those pieces that can help us in the long term? So I've collected a series of headlines here, and I want you just to take a few minutes to look at these headlines. And these start really back in January from the presidential impeachment trial, moving through the pandemic that began in March, along with the economic shutdowns that accompanied that pandemic, the conflicts between states and federal government, moving into some of the summer Black Lives Matter protests, and here more recently the death of a Supreme Court justice and all that is entailed with replacing a Supreme Court justice and the potential change in shift in ideology of the court itself. And then, of course, to things like school openings and reopenings and school closures. And if you just think about all of these headlines and what content goes into and what skills go into students being able to address these questions in kind of meaningful and engaging ways so that they can draw from our study of history and social sciences in order to bring light to these kinds of current issues. And so I think about that in light of visible learning, what we're going to talk about today, and I hope our discussion leads us to think about relevance, to think about the key conceptual understandings that we need to be able to address these kinds of issues that come up. In our immediate need, we know that we're getting a little bit shorter of a year and many things take longer to cover in the kind of virtual remote environment. And so we can begin to think about prioritizing and streamlining. And we use all of these as case studies. That is, these are examples of the kinds of key concepts that we want to teach. Probably prior to the spring of this year, if you taught federalism in any of your courses, you probably didn't use a pandemic as an example of where there would be conflict between state and federal governments. Right? It's just an example, though. It represents a case study that's immediately relevant, especially this past spring, but even continuing here into the fall. And so that's what we want to promote with visible learning, the idea that we're going to use these relevant examples or case studies in order to illustrate some bigger conceptual understandings. And then last, I think we do visible learning, and we do it now because it does promote collaboration. That is, we can get together as professionals and have conversations about what the key conceptual understandings are in social studies, and then looking at the strategies that help us to get to those key conceptual understandings, to help us understand them at a surface level, at a deep level, and then to be able to transfer them. And that really is the essence of where we want to go today. We will just scratch the surface of looking at the three phases of learning. We will not be able to get in depth to any particular one of these strategies, or these phases of learning rather, but we'll simply look at what they are and try to match up some of the key strategies with them, and to see that the ultimate goal is to transfer, that we can take some of these conceptual understandings and begin to apply them to the kinds of current issues and events that you see here in the headlines. So foundational to visible learning for social studies is John Hattie's work on high impact strategies. And if you've been around for a while, we've been discussing John Hattie and high impact strategies for about 4 or 5 years in the district. And you have probably seen before the barometer of influences. So the basic idea here being that we want teaching strategies that fall within what Hattie has called the zone of desired effects. That is, those strategies that have an effect size greater than 0.4. Now, I've listed out some of those from Hattie's research, and there are many more strategies that are included in his research, but these are just a few of the strategies. I want you to take a few minutes here to look at these strategies and then to think about them in light of their effect sizes and see if there's anything that maybe surprises you or stands out when you look at these strategies. So we have jigsaw at 1.2, which is obviously very high on the chart. We have scaffolding at 0.82, classroom discussion at 0.8, teacher clarity at 0.75, reciprocal teaching at 0.74, feedback at 0.7, vocabulary program still high, 0.63, direct instruction 0.6, inquiry-based teaching lower at 0.4, and gaming and simulations even lower at 0.35. Now, some of this might run contrary to what you've thought when you've studied teaching and learning strategies before, especially the fact that things like inquiry-based teaching and gaming and simulations are a little bit lower. And maybe you're surprised at some of the ones that are as high as they are. But I think here this quote from Hattie and Stern in their book, Visible Learning for Social Studies, helps to illustrate the fact that they note here it's important to note that some of the aggregate scores mask situations in which specific actions can be strategically used to improve students' understanding. So in other words, even though some of these strategies may be high overall or may be generally not in the zone of desired effects, that doesn't mean that we should simply toss these strategies aside, that these strategies can be used in strategic ways, right? And so this is the point here, is to look at then, as we're going to the 3 phases of learning, and determine when are these strategies most appropriate. So again, these are just aggregate scores. They don't necessarily look at the question of, well, what is it that we're trying to learn and at what depth are we trying to learn it? So when we get into these 3 phases of learning, we'll see that there are specific strategies that are actually more tailored depending on whether we're trying to do surface level learning, deep learning, or transfer. So let's look at what we mean then by these 3 phases of learning. So surface level learning is what happens when students gain an initial understanding of the concepts, terms, skills, facts, and vocabulary of a given topic. And then we move up the pyramid here to deep learning. Students begin to make connections between these ideas and to generalize about broader principles. So think back to what I said at the beginning here about using case studies or using examples. So we're going to, at the surface level, unpack some key concepts, and then at the deeper level, we're going to make some connections between and among these key concepts so that we can draw out and generalize broader principles. And then at the highest level, we want to be able to transfer this information so that students apply these connections that they've made in deep level learning to new situations. Again, let's think back to our headlines. At least pandemics, at least in our lifetime, for example, or the idea of widespread school closures and certainly going to all remote learning are new situations. But how do we apply the conceptual understandings that we've made from our history classes into these new contexts and new situations that we've never encountered before? And that really depends on how well we've built our conceptual understandings and our skill sets to be able to move from deep level understanding to transfer into new contexts and situations. And so you can see the independence of the learner also increasing as we go up the pyramid. So let's dig in a little more to surface level learning. At surface level, we can break this down into two subcategories. We would talk about concept acquisition and then consolidation. So acquisition meaning our initial understanding of these key concepts, and then our consolidation where we dig in a little bit deeper to the concept itself, but not so deep that we're making connections across different examples. So the questions we have, first of all, let's discuss what we mean by concept, and then why is it important to organize information into conceptual categories at all? What are some examples of key concepts in social studies? That's something you'll discuss it in breakout groups. How is surface learning different from rote learning? And then what teaching and learning strategies promote initial concept attainment? So if we were to look at a concept map or a Freyer model here of the concept, we look at its definition being an organizing idea. That is, concepts are abstract. They're a generic idea that's generalized from all the particular instances of it. Again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning. That's why we're looking at case studies or examples of these concepts. Its characteristics, they're mental representations. In other words, they're abstract. They're not physical and tangible. Another characteristic of concepts is that there's a hierarchy to them. That is, we might talk about very large macro concepts and then some of the smaller sub-concepts that are underneath those larger macro concepts. We might think about macro and micro concepts. They're instantiated or represented by all the specific instances of them that occur. Some examples then of concepts. If we're talking about war, that is a mental representation. It's an abstract idea. It's a way of explaining what we mean when we talk about groups of individuals gathering weapons and usually with government-sponsored conflict and use of those weapons between them, and it's just a mouthful to say every time. So we come up with a category that represents what we mean by war, right? And of course, in recent decades, we've expanded our concept of war to include things like a war on drugs or a war on terror. But what do we mean by war? That's a concept. Environment is a concept. Democracy is an abstract concept that's often applied to as a category of government. But democracy could be a smaller subset of a broader category of power and governance, for example. If we think about regions, whether we define them as political regions, cultural regions, physical regions, that's just an abstract concept that we use to explain how the characteristics of a particular area are similar. Cultural diffusion would be another concept that we would explain, especially in our 6th grade and in 7th grade. We talk a lot about cultural diffusion and how it occurs through trade. So when we look at non-examples then, these non-examples are simply instances of the various example concepts. So the War of 1812, for example, is a specific instance of a war. The Nile River, or really should probably say the Nile River Valley, is an example of a particular environment that students would study. 1776 being a specific year in which we might talk about the beginnings of American democracy. President Abraham Lincoln would be an example of someone who's in power and governing the United States. France would be the example of really both a political and a cultural region. Silk would be a specific tangible product that's traded along what's called the Silk Road and is part of cultural diffusion. So we get the idea here then that the examples of concepts are these broad categories of information, and then the non-examples are really the specific instances. And so all of those specific instances would make up the broader conceptual categories. So let's take a look at an organizing concept here. And first we note that what distinguishes beginning learners from experts is that beginning learners really simply see information as separate, discrete pieces of information, whereas experts are able to see information as organized sets of ideas. So if we take here on the left all of these discrete pieces of information, the Silk Road, trade, conquest, the 1300s, technology, the Mongols, cultural exchange, indirect rule, the Huanghu Emperor, we see all these different distinct pieces of information. But what the expert does is understands that all of these discrete pieces of information fit into a bigger concept. And the concept here that we're talking about is the idea of an empire, or really empire building. So this is just one specific instance of empire building that we would study, and this one would happen to be in 7th grade world history, and it wouldn't be the first instance of empire building either. But this is an important concept that underlies not just 7th grade social studies, but will carry on into 8th grade as the students begin to study exploration and colonization, and into high school world history as students study more modern day imperialism. And it's one that has ramifications even for today when we still talk about issues of decolonization. So the concept attainment questions here we're looking at, what are the conceptual understandings we want students to know? We want them to understand how are empires created? How are empires maintained? How are they ruled? What are the effects of empire building? How do empires deal with resistance within them? So again, at the surface level, we're using this particular example of the Mongols as a case study. But what we want to do then is be able to generalize out, and we're going to, at deep level understanding, be able to compare some of the different empires that we study along the lines of these concept attainment questions. Now, as we think about concepts, I also want to draw your attention here to the big 6 ideas and the overarching essential questions that now guide all of our curricular documents. And so last year we came up with these big 6 ideas, and then this summer we mapped all of these big 6 concepts to every social studies course in 6 through 12. So again, thinking about concepts as a hierarchy, we want students to understand change, democracy, diversity, evidence, justice, and power. So empire building, for example, might fall as a kind of a sub-concept or a micro-concept that falls under the category of power. Or we might also talk about it in the context of justice or diversity or democracy. So these big 6 ideas are designed to cut across all of our courses, to be kind of organizing concepts across all of our courses. And then you can get into the specific examples within a given course of the things that we need to know related to diversity, power, and justice, and evidence, and democracy, and change within a given course. So, for example, when we talk about change, and you can see from some of the overarching essential questions, one of the things we might talk about change is what constitutes a revolution. It's important to note here when we're talking about surface level learning that there's a difference between simply having rote memorization and actually learning concepts at the surface level. When we do rote memorization, we're simply talking about memorizing without an established purpose. That is, we don't necessarily have an understanding of the what and the why. So if we're simply memorizing locations of places and countries and capitals, or states and capitals, and those kinds of things, or memorizing the US presidents in order or something to that effect, or memorizing a lot of dates on a particular timeline without making any of those conceptual connections. If we're just learning 1776 and 1787 and 1789 and 1791 without connecting them to significant concepts in history, then we're simply we're simply doing rote memorization rather than actual surface learning. I've given you 3 quotes here, and as we go to breakout here, I want you to think about some of these quotes in relationship to surface level learning. Hattie and Stern say that when students are able to recall important locations or events automatically, it frees up brain power to focus on more complex thinking. So here we can see there is a need to be able to recall certain events and locations, right? That we're not talking about rote memorization without a purpose, but that we do want students to know in a strategic way, to know certain factual pieces of information to free up their brain power for more complex thinking. And we know that in the 21st century, we can look up everything on the internet. But imagine how time-consuming it is to simply look up every piece of information on the internet and to not even be able to have a discussion or think deeper about things without looking up every single piece of information. The second quote I think that's important is Hattie and Stern note that students who have a need for surface level learning are probably not going to do well with a series of problem-based lessons. And this goes back to what we looked at when we talked about the high impact strategies. And why is inquiry-based learning lower than some of those other kinds of strategies? And it typically happens, Hattie argues, because what we're doing is really introducing inquiry-based learning too early in the process, before students have really attained some of the understandings and the key concepts to be able to do inquiry. And so that's the argument is we can still use inquiry-based learning and it can be effective under the right circumstances, but we need to build the surface level understanding first in order to move into inquiry-based lessons. And then finally, they note that too often learning ends at the surface level, as up to 90% of instructional time is devoted to conveying facts and procedures. So again, our goal today is to look at how we move from surface level learning, which is important and is different from simple rote memorization, to look at how we do deeper understanding and eventually move to transfer. So as we head to our first breakout session, I want you to think about these three questions. I want you to discuss the three quotes a little bit more in depth and discuss how do these quotes impact your teaching about concepts. And then second, give an example of a concept you are teaching or about to teach. And what strategies do you use to teach this concept at the surface level, that is the initial concept attainment and consolidation? What do you use? What strategies do you employ to teach that?